The plus-size waitress stopped pouring coffee. Her eyes locked on the silver ring around the handsome businessman's finger. "Sir, my brother has one exactly like that." A bodyguard seized her wrist. "How do you know that ring?" Nobody breathed. The businessman raised one hand, and the guard released her instantly. Then he slowly stood. "Tell me your brother's name." No one in that room realized the city's most feared mafia boss had waited 20 years to hear the answer. Ethan Bennett. The name left Rosalie's lips softly, but its effect on Dante was immediate. His expression did not break. A man like him had spent too many years learning how to hide what could be used against him. But his hand tightened around the coffee cup. For one brief second, he forgot to breathe. "Ethan Bennett," he repeated. Rosalie nodded. "My older brother." Dante lowered the cup without drinking. Around the table, the men in dark suits remained perfectly still. The bodyguard who had grabbed Rosalie watched her with open suspicion, waiting for Dante to give an order. Instead, Dante looked toward the door. "Everyone out." No one questioned him. Chairs moved, men disappeared into the corridor. Even the club manager, who had rushed toward the private dining room after hearing the disturbance, stopped when Dante glanced at him. "You too." Within seconds, Rosalie stood alone with a stranger, powerful enough to empty one of the city's most exclusive dining rooms, with 3 words. For the first time, she wondered exactly who he was. Dante gestured toward the chair opposite him. "Please." "I'm working." Something almost resembling amusement touched his face. "Then stand, if that makes you more comfortable." Rosalie folded her hands in front of her apron. Dante looked again at the silver ring. "Your brother was a firefighter?" Her polite expression changed. "Yes." "Where?" "Station 14, most of his career." Dante's thumb slowly moved across the engraving. "And he died?" Rosalie hesitated. There was something strange about the question. Not curiosity, not sympathy, recognition. "On duty?" "How long ago?" "Almost 20 years." Silence settled between them. Rosalie had spent years learning the different ways people reacted when they heard about Ethan. Some apologized. Some called him a hero. Others became uncomfortable because death made strangers search desperately for the correct thing to say. Dante did none of those things. He simply looked at the ring. "What was he like?" That question caught her off guard. Rosalie's shoulders relaxed slightly. "Annoying." Dante finally looked up. She smiled despite herself. "He thought being my older brother made him responsible for everything. Broken bicycle? Ethan fixed it. Bad day at school? Ethan somehow knew before I told him. If somebody made me cry, he suddenly had a very serious reason to walk me home the next afternoon." A faint warmth entered her voice. "He burned almost everything he cooked, though, so the heroic reputation was slightly exaggerated." For the first time that evening, Dante smiled. It disappeared quickly. "Did he wear the ring often?" "Almost every day." "Was there another one?" Rosalie's smile faded. Her gaze dropped to Dante's hand. "Yes." Dante became completely still. "They were a pair," she said. "At least that's what Ethan told me." "Do you know where the second one went?" "No." Her answer seemed to land harder than she expected. "After he died, we got some of his belongings back. His watch, his jacket, a few things from his locker." She paused. "But only one ring." Dante looked away. Rosalie studied him now. "Did you know Ethan?" His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I knew what kind of man he was." "That isn't what I asked." His eyes returned to hers. Most people would have backed away from that stare. Rosalie didn't. Dante seemed to notice. "No," he said quietly. "Not in the way you're thinking." Then he asked, "Did Ethan ever tell you what was engraved inside the rings?" Rosalie's breathing changed. She had not mentioned an engraving, not once. Her eyes dropped again to the silver band around his finger. "How do you know there was one?" Dante said nothing. Rosalie took a small step closer. For the first time, the intimidating businessman was no longer the mystery that frightened her. He was the mystery she needed to understand. "Who are you?" Dante slowly turned the ring around his finger until its worn inner edge caught the light. Then he looked at her with an expression Rosalie could not name. Grief, perhaps, or gratitude, carried for far too many years. "Someone," he said, "who has been trying to find Ethan Bennett for almost 20 years. Rosalie stared at him, and suddenly she understood one thing with terrifying certainty. This man had not merely known her brother. He knew a part of Ethan's life that even she had never been told. 20 years earlier, Dante Moretti had not been a man people feared. He had been an 18-year-old boy choking on smoke. The warehouse fire had started shortly after midnight. By the time the first crews arrived, flames had already swallowed the eastern side of the building. Several families had been attending a charity distribution event inside, and in the confusion, no one knew exactly how many people remained trapped. Ethan Bennett entered with the second rescue team. He was not thinking about becoming a hero. He was thinking about finding whoever was still alive. Inside, visibility had collapsed to almost nothing. Ethan moved through the smoke by touch and training, calling out whenever he stopped to listen. Then he heard coughing. He followed it behind a partially collapsed storage partition and found Dante pressed against the floor. The young man's face was blackened with soot. One sleeve had been torn. He had tried twice to find an exit and failed both times. When Ethan reached for him, Dante recoiled. "Don't touch me." Ethan stared through his mask. "That's going to make rescuing you inconvenient." Even terrified, Dante blinked at him. Ethan extended his hand again. "Come on!" Something in his voice made Dante obey. The journey out became worse before it became better. A section of ceiling collapsed behind them. Ethan pushed Dante ahead, keeping himself between the boy and the worst of the heat. Whenever Dante slowed, Ethan spoke. Not heroic words, not promises that everything would be fine. Simple instructions. "Stay low. Keep moving. Look at me. Breathe." Years later, those were the details Dante remembered most clearly. Ethan had never treated him like someone helpless. He had treated him like someone worth getting home. They reached the loading entrance, minutes before conditions inside became impossible. Outside, paramedics rushed toward them. Firefighters shouted names. Survivors cried for relatives, while emergency crews tried to establish who had escaped and who was still missing. Dante should have disappeared into that chaos. Instead, Ethan caught his shoulder. "Wait." He pulled off one glove. 2 simple silver rings were threaded onto a cord beneath his protective clothing. Ethan removed one. Dante stared as the firefighter pressed it into his soot-covered palm. "What is this?" "A reminder." "For what?" Ethan closed Dante's fingers around the ring. "When you become strong, protect someone else." Dante looked down at the silver band. "Why are you giving it to me?" But someone screamed from inside the warehouse. Ethan's head turned instantly. There were still people trapped. He squeezed Dante's shoulder once, then ran back toward the fire. Dante never spoke to him again. Hours later, Father Michael Hayes found the young survivor, sitting beneath an emergency blanket, staring at the ring in his hand. The retired chaplain would remember that night for decades. Exhausted firefighters, frightened children, families waiting for names, and the silent young man who refused to release a small silver ring. Father Michael sat beside him. "The firefighter gave me this," Dante finally said. Michael examined it only briefly, enough to notice the worn engraving inside. He went back in. "Yes. What's his name?" Dante looked toward the emergency crews. "I only heard someone call him Ethan." Father Michael remained beside him until morning. By sunrise, the terrible cost of the fire was becoming clear. Ethan Bennett had helped bring several people out that night. He did not come home, and Dante carried one sentence away from the ruins: when you become strong, protect someone else. Over the years, the frightened survivor became a man whose name could silence rooms. His world grew harder. His influence grew larger. Men learned to fear him long before they understood him. But the silver ring remained. Not because Dante believed jewelry could repay a life. It remained because every time power tempted him to forget what strength was for, he could feel Ethan Bennett's final lesson against his skin. For 20 years, Dante never removed it. And now, standing across from Ethan's sister, he finally knew the name that belonged to the man behind the promise. Rosalie remained silent for several seconds. The dining room suddenly felt different. The silver ring was no longer a coincidence. Neither was the way Dante had reacted to Ethan's name. "You were there," she said. Dante did not pretend to misunderstand. "Yes." "At the warehouse?" "Yes." Rosalie looked at the man before her. The immaculate suit, the controlled voice, the kind of authority that made armed men leave a room without hesitation. Then she tried to imagine him frightened and 18 years old, surrounded by smoke. "You were the boy." Dante's gaze dropped briefly to the ring. "Your brother pulled me out." The words struck Rosalie harder than she expected. For nearly 20 years, Ethan's final shift had existed in fragments: official reports, condolences, newspaper clippings, stories from firefighters who had survived. There had been numbers, people rescued, people injured, people lost. But numbers did not have faces. Now one of those lives was sitting across from her. Rosalie lowered herself into the chair Dante had offered earlier. "My mother always wondered," she whispered. Dante waited. She used to say that knowing someone came home because Ethan went inside would make losing him hurt differently. Rosalie swallowed. "Not less. Just differently." Dante's composure shifted. "I wish I could have told her." Rosalie looked up. "She died 6 years ago." His eyes closed for the briefest moment. Another chance lost. "I searched for him," Dante said. "At first, all I had was Ethan." "No last name?" "Not one I trusted. I was taken to the hospital before I could ask." Years later, when Dante finally possessed the resources to search properly, the trail had already grown cold. Records from the disaster were incomplete. Names appeared differently across reports, and several rescue crews had rotated through the scene. He found firefighters named Ethan. None had the ring. He found survivors who remembered a rescuer. None knew enough. He hired investigators. He revisited archived reports. He quietly contacted retired emergency personnel. Every promising lead ended somewhere else. Eventually, Dante stopped expecting success. He never stopped searching. Rosalie stared at his hand. "All these years?" "All of them." "Why?" The question was simple. Dante's answer was not. "Because I built a life Ethan never got to have." Rosalie's expression tightened. "That wasn't your choice?" "No." "Then don't make surviving sound like something you did to him." Dante went still. Very few people corrected Dante Moretti. Fewer did it twice. Rosalie apparently had no interest in either statistic. My brother didn't pull people out of fires so they could spend 20 years apologizing for being alive. Something unfamiliar passed through Dante's eyes. Not anger, recognition, perhaps even relief. Rosalie leaned back slightly. If Ethan gave you that ring, he wanted you to keep going. He told me to protect someone else. Then do that. I have tried. She studied him. There was weight behind those words she could not yet understand. Who exactly are you? This time Dante answered. Dante Moretti. Rosalie knew the name. Everyone did. Moretti Global appeared on towers, investment reports, hospitals, construction projects, and charity galas. Dante Moretti rarely gave interviews, yet his influence seemed to exist everywhere. But Rosalie also knew there were rumors attached to the name. Rumors people lowered their voices to repeat. She searched his face. The Dante Moretti? A hint of dry amusement appeared. I wasn't aware there were several. Rosalie almost laughed. Almost. Then she noticed something more important. For the first time since entering the room, Dante was not looking at the ring. He was looking at her. Not because she resembled Ethan. She didn't. Not because she possessed information he needed. He seemed genuinely interested in the woman who had just told him that 20 years of guilt might not be the tribute he believed it was. Outside the partially closed door, Victor Sloan had arrived. The club chairman had personally overseen Dante's dinner because men of Dante's stature could change a private club's fortunes with a single recommendation. Victor expected to find his staff invisible and obedient. Instead, through the narrow opening, he saw Rosalie Bennett sitting at Dante Moretti's table, and Dante was listening to her. Not politely, intently. Several feet behind Victor stood Celeste Whitmore. Her gaze moved from Rosalie to Dante. Then it hardened. Rosalie had no idea anyone was watching, but the private conversation that had begun with a silver ring was no longer private. And outside that door, two people had already begun wondering why Dante Moretti was giving a waitress something almost no one could buy from him. His undivided attention. By the next afternoon, Rosalie understood how quickly curiosity could become accusation. Victor Sloan summoned her before the dinner shift. Celeste Whitmore was already in his office. That alone told Rosalie this was not a normal staff meeting. Victor remained behind his polished desk. Sit down, Miss Bennett. I'd rather stand. His mouth tightened. Celeste studied Rosalie with the cool patience of someone examining an object whose price she doubted. Victor folded his hands. You told Mr. Moretti that your deceased brother owned a ring identical to his. I told him what I recognized. And somehow this extraordinary coincidence resulted in you spending nearly an hour alone with one of our most important members. Rosalie stared at him. Is that what this is about? Celeste answered. It's about credibility. She placed several printed pages on the desk. Celeste had already begun investigating Rosalie's history. She had confirmed Ethan Bennett existed and that he had served as a firefighter, but she had found no public record connecting Ethan to Dante Moretti. No photograph, no interview, no documented friendship. Nothing explaining why one of the city's most powerful men would possess Ethan's ring. Celeste leaned back. You must admit how convenient it sounds. Rosalie's face warmed. My brother died 20 years ago. I don't use him for convenience. Victor's expression remained cold. The club cannot allow employees to manufacture personal connections with guests. I manufactured nothing. Then prove it. The demand struck harder than Rosalie expected. Not because she doubted Ethan, because Victor had turned her brother's memory into evidence she was now required to produce. I don't owe you proof of my grief. You owe this institution an explanation. Rosalie looked from Victor to Celeste and understood that the decision had already been made. By evening, the rumor had spread. Staff members stopped talking when she entered the service corridor. A supervisor quietly removed her from Dante's private dining assignment. Then Victor made the humiliation complete. In front of senior staff and several guests waiting near the private lounge, he announced that Rosalie was being suspended, pending an investigation into inappropriate conduct involving a distinguished member. Rosalie felt every eye turn toward her. She untied her apron carefully. Victor seemed almost disappointed when she did not cry. Then a voice came from behind him. What inappropriate conduct? The corridor went silent. Dante stood near the entrance. Victor's posture changed immediately. Mr. Moretti, this is an internal personnel matter. It involves me. Victor hesitated. Dante looked at Rosalie. Did he suspend you? Yes. Dante reached into his jacket for his phone. Victor went pale. Rosalie knew instinctively what would happen next. One call. Perhaps two. A man with Dante's influence could make Victor regret this before dinner service began. Don't. Dante stopped. Rosalie stepped toward him. If you fix this because you're Dante Moretti, they'll say I used you exactly the way they're accusing me of using you. His gaze sharpened. They humiliated you. Yes. And you're willing to accept that? No. Her answer came without hesitation. I want them to admit they were wrong because the truth proves it, not because they're afraid of you. Dante slowly lowered the phone. Victor appeared relieved. He shouldn't have been. Something had changed in Dante's expression. Not rage, respect. Rosalie picked up her coat. If Ethan gave you that ring, there will be a trail somewhere. We find it. We? She looked at him. You've searched 20 years. Apparently you need better help. For a moment, Dante almost smiled. Rosalie walked past Victor without another word. But outside the club, her composure finally cracked. Her hands trembled as she buttoned her coat. She could endure losing shifts. What she could not endure was hearing strangers suggest that Ethan's memory was a trick she had invented for access to a powerful man. Inside, Celeste watched through the glass doors. She had expected Rosalie to retreat. Instead, Rosalie had challenged Dante Moretti, refused his protection, and somehow earned more of his attention. Celeste turned toward Victor. Find the original fire records. Victor frowned. And if she's telling the truth? Celeste's expression hardened. Then we find out before Moretti does. For Rosalie, the accusation was no longer merely about a job. By morning, whispers about her supposed deception had already reached people beyond the club. Her professional reputation was beginning to fracture. And now there was only one way to restore it. They had to prove what happened in that fire 20 years ago. The first real break came from the municipal archives. The warehouse fire had produced hundreds of pages of records, many never digitized. Dante's investigators found dispatch logs, casualty reports, handwritten crew assignments, and photographs taken during the emergency response. Rosalie refused to let Dante's people do all the work. 3 days after her suspension, she sat beside him at a long archive table, turning pages that smelled of dust and age. Then she stopped. There it was. Bennett Ethan. Station 14, assigned to Interior Rescue. Dante stared at the line. Rosalie touched her brother's name with one finger. That proves he was there, she said. But not the ring. No. They kept searching. An hour later, Dante found a photograph. It showed exhausted firefighters and survivors gathered outside the warehouse. The image was grainy, but Rosalie recognized Ethan immediately. There! Her voice broke. Dante followed her finger. Ethan stood near an ambulance, helmet beneath one arm. Around his neck was a thin cord. 2 silver rings hung from it. Dante's hand instinctively closed around the ring he wore. For 20 years, he had possessed half the answer. Now they had an image of the other half. But Rosalie still wanted something stronger. A photograph could establish the rings existed. It could not prove Ethan had given one to Dante. That answer came from Father Michael Hayes. His name appeared repeatedly in survivor assistance records from the fire. When they located him, the retired chaplain agreed to meet them at a modest parish office across the city. Father Michael was older now, his hair completely white. Dante had barely introduced himself when Michael's attention dropped to his hand. The old man became silent. "May I see that?" Dante removed the ring for the first time in years. Father Michael turned it over carefully and examined the faded Latin engraving inside. His eyes lifted. "You kept it." Rosalie stopped breathing. Dante's voice lowered. "You remember me?" "I remember a frightened young man wrapped in a grey emergency blanket who wouldn't let go of this ring." Father Michael looked at Rosalie. "And I remember the firefighter who wore its match." Rosalie's eyes filled. "My brother?" "Ethan." Father Michael remembered him clearly. He described Ethan returning repeatedly toward the rescue area despite exhaustion. More importantly, he remembered sitting beside Dante afterward and hearing the young survivor explain that a firefighter named Ethan had placed the ring in his hand before returning to help others. No one had known then that the detail would matter 20 years later. Now it mattered enormously. Victor Sloan had demanded proof. Dante decided Victor would receive it. The following evening, the club's executive committee assembled in the same private dining room where Rosalie had first noticed the ring. Victor attended. So did Celeste. Rosalie stood beside Dante, not behind him. Dante placed copies of the rescue record and photograph on the table. Father Michael sat nearby. Then Dante spoke. "Mr. Sloan accused Miss Bennet of fabricating a dead brother's history to gain my attention." Victor shifted. "I acted to protect the club." "No, you acted before establishing the facts." Dante's voice never rose. That made the room quieter. "The rescue record confirms Ethan Bennett was inside that warehouse. The photograph confirms he possessed 2 matching rings. Father Hayes remembers seeing one of those rings in my possession immediately after I was rescued. He placed his ring beside the photograph. The second ring has been on my hand for 20 years. Victor's face drained of color. Celeste stared at the evidence she had helped uncover. Dante continued. "Rosalie Bennett did not approach me for money. She did not request access, employment, influence, or favors. When I offered to intervene after her suspension, she refused." His gaze settled on Victor. "She asked for one thing, the truth." Nobody answered. Rosalie realized then why the moment felt different from revenge. Dante was not destroying Victor. He was removing every excuse Victor had used to justify humiliating her. The executive committee formally rescinded Rosalie's suspension. Her personnel record was cleared. Victor was required to issue both a written and public apology, while the board announced an internal review of his conduct. Celeste said little. Her investigation, intended to expose Rosalie, had instead constructed the evidence that vindicated her. When Victor finally faced Rosalie, his apology sounded painfully rehearsed. Rosalie let him finish. "I accept the correction," she said. "The apology will mean something when the people who heard the accusation hear the truth too." Dante looked at her with quiet approval. Later, after everyone had gone, Rosalie returned to the old photograph. She was no longer looking at Dante. She was looking at Ethan. For days, Powerful people had argued over whether she was lying, but the evidence had done something larger than clear her name. It had brought her brother back into focus. Not as a rumor, not as leverage, not even as a hero frozen in memory. As Ethan Bennett, a tired firefighter carrying 2 silver rings who had saved a frightened young man and asked for nothing in return except that one day, when that boy became strong, he protect someone else. 2 weeks after Rosalie returned to work, Dante asked her to meet him somewhere that had nothing to do with the dining club. She arrived expecting another conversation about Ethan. Instead, Dante placed a folder in front of her. On its cover were 5 words: "The Ethan Bennett Legacy Scholarship." Rosalie stared at them. What is this? A beginning. Dante had spent the previous weeks studying programs available to families of firefighters killed in the line of duty. He discovered something that bothered him. Ceremonies were plentiful, but long-term support was inconsistent. He wanted to fund university tuition, vocational training, books, counseling, and emergency educational expenses for the children of fallen firefighters. Not for 1 year. Permanently. Rosalie closed the folder. No. Dante blinked. No. You've already made the first mistake. Most people presented proposals to Dante Moretti, hoping he would approve them. Rosalie returned his with corrections. You named it after Ethan before asking whether Ethan would have wanted that. Dante leaned back. Would he? He hated attention. Then what would you call it? Rosalie thought for a moment. The Second Alarm Foundation. Dante's brow lifted. When one crew needs help, she explained, another alarm brings more people. The point isn't one hero. It's that nobody carries everything alone. Dante looked at the abandoned title on the folder. Then he crossed it out. The Second Alarm Foundation. Rosalie smiled. Better. That was how their partnership began. Dante supplied resources. Rosalie supplied boundaries. When his advisors proposed an expensive launch gala, Rosalie replaced half the budget with additional scholarships. When Dante suggested putting Ethan's portrait in the foundation's entrance, she agreed only if the wall honored other fallen firefighters too. And when a consultant wrote promotional language describing sacrifice as glorious, Rosalie deleted the entire paragraph. Families don't need us romanticizing the worst day of their lives. Dante read her revision. You're very comfortable telling me I'm wrong. You keep giving me opportunities. He smiled more often after that. Weeks became months. Rosalie gradually discovered that Dante listened far more carefully than his reputation suggested. He remembered that she took her coffee without sugar. He learned she became quiet, not angry, when something truly upset her. And when meetings ran late, a car would be waiting outside, not because Dante ordered her into it, but because he asked whether she wanted one. The distinction mattered. Rosalie noticed it. Dante noticed that she noticed. She also began seeing pieces of him that had nothing to do with Moretti Global or the darker rumors surrounding his name. He personally read scholarship applications. He remembered children's names. When one applicant wrote that she planned to become a paramedic because her father had been one, Dante reread the sentence 3 times before placing the application in the approved stack. Rosalie said nothing. She simply moved the next file closer to him. Their relationship changed in moments like that. Quietly, without either of them announcing it. One evening, they were the last 2 people remaining in the foundation office. Rosalie found Dante staring at Ethan's old photograph. You're doing it again. What? Turning this into a debt. Dante looked at her. I thought you'd stopped correcting me. I can start charging. That earned a soft laugh. Then Rosalie became serious. Ethan gave you a direction, Dante, not a sentence. His eyes stayed on hers. For 20 years, he had measured himself against a dying man's final act. Rosalie was asking him to understand something more difficult. Gratitude did not have to hurt forever to be real. "I don't know what my life would have been if he hadn't found me," Dante admitted. "You don't have to know." "He lost his." "Yes," Rosalie's voice softened. "And I miss him every day. But if you turn your survival into punishment, then the fire gets to take something from both of you." Dante had no answer. Rosalie reached for the photograph, straightened it, then stepped back. Honor him by living well. Dante looked at her differently after that. Not as Ethan Bennett's sister. Not as the woman connected to the mystery he had chased for 2 decades. Rosalie had become the person who could look directly at the parts of him everyone else feared and speak without fear herself. He respected her judgment. He waited for her laughter. He noticed when she entered a room. And increasingly, he noticed when she left it. Rosalie felt the change, too. She had once watched Dante because she wanted answers about Ethan. Now she caught herself watching him when he wasn't speaking at all. That frightened her more than his bodyguards ever had. At the Foundation's first scholarship presentation, Rosalie stood beside Dante as 3 families received letters guaranteeing their children's education. One mother began crying. Dante quietly stepped aside and let Rosalie comfort her. Later, when the room emptied, Rosalie found him alone near the doorway. "You kept the promise," she said. Dante touched the silver ring. "Not alone." Their eyes met. Neither moved. Neither named what had grown between them. But for the first time, the silence no longer belonged to Ethan. It belonged entirely to them. 6 months later, the Second Alarm Foundation had stopped feeling like a project. It had become part of their lives. 23 students now received support. Rosalie knew every family by name. Dante knew which applications she would fight for before she even entered his office. They had also developed rituals neither acknowledged. Coffee after late meetings, Sunday phone calls that somehow began with foundation business and ended an hour later. Dante sending Rosalie photographs of catastrophically burned dinners, Rosalie replying with the phone number of a nearby restaurant. Their relationship had become easy. That was precisely what frightened her. One evening, after a scholarship committee meeting, they walked alone through the Foundation's quiet reception hall. Dante was telling her about a student accepted into nursing school when he realized Rosalie had stopped listening. "What is it?" She looked at him. "I need to ask you something." "Ask." Rosalie hesitated. For months, she had trusted the way Dante treated her. He never tried to purchase her affection. He never demanded her time. He had learned when protection became interference and when silence was more useful than advice. But one question remained. Would we be standing here if Ethan hadn't died? Dante's expression changed. No. The answer came so quickly that Rosalie looked away. Then Dante continued. Because I never would have met you. She looked back. That isn't what I mean. I know. He stepped closer, but left space between them. Rosalie folded her arms. Sometimes I don't know whether you see me or whether you see the last piece of Ethan you finally found. Dante said nothing. That frightened her more than an immediate denial would have. I won't be someone's repayment, she said. Not even yours. You aren't. How do you know? Dante glanced toward Ethan's photograph on the memorial wall. For 20 years, that face had represented a question he could never answer. How could one life ever repay another? Then Rosalie had appeared and challenged the question itself. When I first saw you, Dante said, all I could think about was Ethan. Rosalie absorbed the honesty. When you told me his name, I thought finding you meant I'd finally found a way to settle something that could never be settled. And now you annoy me when I approve bad proposals." Despite herself, Rosalie smiled. "You approve many bad proposals. You steal food from my plate. You order too much. You correct my grammar in text messages. Someone has to." Dante smiled, then his expression softened. "And when something happens, you're the person I want to tell." Rosalie's smile disappeared. Not from hurt, from the sudden intimacy of the truth. Dante continued. "I know when you're pretending not to be tired. I know you hate being called brave when you're simply doing what needs to be done. I know you laugh before delivering an insult because you think it makes the insult kinder. It does. It doesn't." She laughed softly. Dante's gaze remained on her. "I spent years searching for the man who saved me." He paused. "I never imagined I'd find the heart that raised him instead." Rosalie's eyes filled. Dante shook his head slightly. "But that's not why I stayed." The words mattered more than everything before them. "Ethan brought me to you," he said. "You gave me every reason after that." Rosalie looked down, fighting tears. "So this isn't gratitude?" "I am grateful to Ethan every day." Dante stepped closer. "What I feel for you is not gratitude." Her breathing slowed. "What is it?" For a man whose decisions could move companies and silence dangerous rooms, Dante suddenly looked almost uncertain. "Love." Rosalie closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, she saw no debt in his expression. No dead brother standing between them. Only Dante. She touched his hand. The silver ring was cool beneath her fingers. "I was afraid you'd say that." His brow tightened. "Why?" "Because now I have to admit something equally inconvenient." "What?" "I love you too." Dante laughed quietly, almost in disbelief. He lifted one hand toward her face, but stopped before touching her. Rosalie noticed. Even now, he waited. So she closed the distance herself. Their first kiss was gentle. No audience. No dramatic declaration. No debt being paid. When they separated, Rosalie rested her forehead against his. For 20 years, Dante had believed survival created an obligation to the past. Standing there with Rosalie, he finally understood Ethan's lesson differently. Protecting another person did not always mean standing between them and danger. Sometimes it meant respecting their choices. Sometimes it meant building something that outlived grief. And sometimes it meant allowing someone close enough to protect the part of you that had spent years surviving alone. For the first time since the warehouse fire, Dante was no longer living because he owed a dead man his life. He was living because he had finally found a future he wanted for himself. 1 year later, the Second Alarm Foundation held its first annual ceremony. The room was filled with firefighters, surviving spouses, scholarship recipients, and children whose futures had been altered by losses they had never chosen. At the center of the memorial wall hung Ethan Bennett's photograph, among dozens of others. Rosalie stood beside Dante. She no longer wore the uniform of the private dining club. Her work with the foundation had become permanent, not because Dante had given her a position, but because she had helped build one worth accepting. When the final scholarship was announced, Dante approached the memorial wall alone. The room gradually fell silent. For 21 years, a silver ring had remained on his hand, through fear, power, success, guilt, and finally, love. Dante looked at Ethan's photograph. Then he removed the ring. Rosalie's breath caught. She understood immediately. Dante placed it carefully beneath the photograph, beside Ethan's matching ring, which Rosalie had brought from her family's keepsakes for the ceremony. For the first time since the night of the fire, the pair rested together again. Dante touched the edge of Ethan's photograph. There was no speech to the dead, no promise left unpaid. Only gratitude. Then he turned toward Rosalie. She walked to him. Dante took her hand. "Your brother taught me how to survive." Rosalie's eyes filled. Dante looked around at the scholarship recipients before returning his gaze to her. "You taught me how to live." For several seconds, Rosalie could not speak. Then she squeezed his hand. "Ethan didn't save you so you'd spend your life owing him something." Her voice trembled. "He saved you so there would be a life afterward." Dante smiled. Rosalie looked toward the families surrounding them. "And this is the afterward." Applause began somewhere behind them. Then another person stood, and another. Soon the entire room was on its feet. Rosalie leaned against Dante as he looked once more at the 2 silver rings. 20 years earlier, a firefighter had entered a burning warehouse and found a frightened young man who believed survival was slipping away. Ethan could never have known where that single act would lead. He could not have known that the boy would become powerful, that his sister would someday recognize the ring, that an old promise would bring 2 wounded lives together, or that dozens of children would one day receive opportunities because of 5 words spoken in the smoke. When you become strong, protect someone else. Dante had spent 20 years believing the ring was a debt. Rosalie had taught him it was an invitation, and now the promise no longer belonged to one rescued boy. It lived in every family they helped, every future they protected, and every life that would carry Ethan Bennett's kindness forward. One life had been saved in a fire, and because it had been saved, many more would now be protected.